The Cubs' 2025 season is officially over, but could it have been saved if Kyle Tucker was able to connect on that 3-1 fastball that Aaron Ashby threw him in the 6th inning? Let's talk about it today on the final Cubs Daily podcast of the 2025 season. Let's jump right into it here. There's only a couple moments in this game that I think we really need to discuss. The Cubs lose 3-1 and drop Game 5 at American Family Field in Milwaukee to officially lose the NLDS to the Brewers in the two teams' first ever playoff matchup. Top of the 6th inning. This is the moment we showed on our post-game show. It's the moment that Craig Counsell talked about in his post-game presser to close out the season as well. Aaron Ashby versus Kyle Tucker. First and second on, nobody out. And he ends up striking out. He eventually gets to a 3-1 count, and Aaron Ashby throws him two four-seam fastballs back-to-back, the first of which is one that Cliff Floyd broke down extensively on our post-game show. Middle of the plate, and then the 3-2 pitch was more kind of outer black. Pulled it a little bit, good pitch, Tuck swings through it. This is the moment of the series, right? You know, Tucker had the homer off Robert Gasser in Game 4 that I think, as Alex Cohn and I talked about on the previous Cubs Daily podcast, gave us a bit of hope, dangled a carrot of sorts to get us some belief that maybe Kyle Tucker was clicking at the exact moment to eventually help this team in Game 5. Unfortunately, that was not the case. It seems like maybe Robert Gasser was just not particularly good, and the Cubs saw him really well. But again, I've already seen all of it on social media, right? Ripping Kyle Tucker for not mashing this pitch. You know, he slugged over 600 on fastballs middle before and after the All-Star break. So even when he was struggling, he was still able to connect on these four-seam fastballs and sinkers over the middle of the plate. Aaron Ashby's a weird look as a pitcher. He's a really high slot guy. Sinkers left on left is not something a lot of lefties see a lot. And these are not excuses, because the thing that I want to point out really is that Ashby in that 3-1 count threw a four-seam fastball. He's a sinker pitcher. He's only thrown a four-seam fastball about 2% of the time to left-handed hitters this season and the postseason. So this year in total, he only threw this pitch 9 times throughout the entirety of the innings that he covered in 2025. It's not something that I imagine Kyle Tucker was expecting. I didn't hear him talk postgame about it. Didn't seem like anyone asked him specifically about whether he was anticipating four-seam fastball, but I talked to Cliff Floyd a bit about this. The concept here is that, okay, if he's swinging under the four-seam fastball, then he's expecting basically a sinker, or he's not expecting the ball to rise as much because Ashby throws a bunch of these weird sinking fastballs from a high slot. So this is me starting a podcast by defending Kyle Tucker after he really struggled in the second half of the season, and I think for the most part probably cost himself upwards of $100 to $150 million in the open market here. I think personally the highest probability is that he hits free agency and signs maybe not exactly the Alex Bregman deal, but something to the tune of a 3-year, or not a 3-year, but let's say he signs like a 6 or 7 year, but has the ability to opt out after 3 years. If he can repair his value and prove that the last 2 seasons of these weird injuries are not something that is a theme and is more of a blip on the radar of his career, which has otherwise been absolutely exceptional, then yeah, he can probably hit the open market at 30 or 31. Maybe at that point he's no longer an outfielder, but if teams prize him and he has, you know, the ability to put bat on ball as consistently and walk as consistently as he's done in his career, maybe he could recoup and get to a higher interval of money that I think at the beginning of the season we were at least expecting. The last time I talked to Jeff Passan about a month before the end of the season, he suggested that the number of the over-under was probably more around $400 million, whereas the beginning of the season, it seemed like that number, if the Cubs wanted to extend and lock up Tucker after making the big offseason trade, would be around $475 to $500 million in total value. Now I really have no idea what this contract's going to look like. I'm just convinced that he's going to build in some way for him to get out of it such that he can try to recoup some value. You know, he's a fascinating player overall. Like, even in the periods of time where he was struggling, I thought he had a really good approach and he was able to get on base. But it was very clear in these last 4 weeks of the season here and extending into the postseason, he was not a good hitter for the Cubs. You know, sure, he got on base on a reasonable clip, but it was not fun to watch him in the 3-hole, the 4-hole for a lot of these games and just not hitting particularly well. You know, this is a guy that they traded for, and he was unbelievable in April and May. You know, everyone was clamoring in the offseason about how the Cubs didn't have a star. You had a star. They had a star for about 4 months, maybe 3.5-ish months or so. And unfortunately, it just didn't turn out to be the season that everyone hoped it would be, where he posts 7 WAR, rides him into the postseason, goes back to those 2022-ish, I believe it was 2022 playoff moments, Phillies, Astros, he clicks balls off Aaron Nola. It looks unbelievable. He was not the intimidating force in the lineup. The reality is in the postseason for the Cubs, only 3 guys really hit. Michael Busch, Seiya Suzuki, and Nico Horner. Ian Happ with an incredible moment as well. You could probably give him a boost as well in terms of the OPS that he put up in the postseason. But apart from that, they were not particularly productive. I'm looking at some of their OPSs right now, and yeah, you pull up the Cubs lineup in season and you see a bunch of 750 pluses. You pull up the lineup at the end of this game, you see Busch at 1100 OPS, Horner at 972 with a 419 average. Unbelievable the season that he put together overall. And then you have Suzuki at 862 and everybody else is below 750. So the reality of this game 5 was the Cubs had 4 hits and 1 run. You could pitch as good as humanly possible and it's not really going to matter. And for the most part, the guy that everybody hoped would be on the mound for perhaps more innings in this division series, the Cubs didn't necessarily need it overall, but Colin Ray looked pretty good. He went 2 2/3 innings, 4 hits, an earned run, a walk, and 2 strikeouts. Basically made a pretty bad mistake on a cutter to Andrew Vaughn in the 4th inning that made it a 2-1 game, and then Bryce Turang would add on the insurance run in the bottom of the 7th inning off Andrew Kittredge. And yeah, that bottom of the 4th was the moment overall. There were 2 moments in this game, getting a little bit deeper into the analysis of the game itself as opposed to purely that Kyle Tucker at-bat that you could argue to some extent felt like the end of the season, despite the fact it was only in the 6th inning at which it occurred. But that bottom of the 4th inning, Colin Ray on the mound, he gives up the homer. Again, cutter middle of the plate, then goes single. Really odd play in center field by Pete Crow Armstrong to have a ball bounce basically off his chest. Dansby Swanson also threw a ball above Michael Busch on a pretty routine play with Joey Ortiz. I believe an inning or 2 prior to that in the 2nd or the 3rd. So there were some odd plays in this game that were very out of the ordinary, I think, for a Cubs team that ranked as at least top 3 in baseball in defensive runs saved and defensive value they'd produced. They've been really nails on all the fundamentals, and it felt like there were moments in this game where it was just a little bit off overall. But again, a testament to the Cubs, I think. You want to hat tip them in this game 5. The 2 instances, putting Ortiz on, the 9-hitter, through an error to let the top of the order come up with a man on base. No runs came of that. The Vaughn homer is a mistake, but they kept it at 2-1 out of that inning. They ended up going Palencia for Joey Ortiz, which was an interesting decision, but I do believe with the game on the line, the season on the line, you have to go with your best right matchup there. Ray didn't look particularly great, especially after a 4-pitch walk. I get the idea of really trying to dangle it and go, no, we need Palencia for later innings, but that was a correct move by me, and it ended up correct move in my opinion, and it ended up being the correct move. It's just the Cubs didn't hit, and that I think was the theme of the second half of the season. Cubs offense has been basically league average since the All-Star break, and you look at the aggregates, and it looks like an unbelievable offense, top 5, 6 in all of baseball, maybe top 6, 7 or so in that window. They barrel the ball at a top 5 rate, don't strike out, they walk a ton. They weren't particularly amazing with runners in scoring position, but they scored so many runs via home run overall that, for the most part, that usually wins in the playoffs. We'd seen that with a lot of other teams. The Dodgers in particular score a bunch of their runs through home runs. They also have very good hitters otherwise, but there's a very clear reason why they're in the NLCS now against the Brewers. Not a ton of things to hit on with this game. It's a tough loss. There was a lot of pivotal moments. I thought it was a pretty good game overall, honestly. Again, the Cubs just didn't hit. It wasn't like, it's better that we're talking about the Cubs not hitting than I think those Dansby errors turning into, or not error or individual, turning into a moment that is going to be like, is he worth the contract? Of course he's been worth the contract. He's been one of the best players on this team. He's been a metronome for the last 3 or 4 years. Or PCA in center field kind of muffling that ball. If Durbin ends up coming home and that's a run that scores, that becomes the topic of the game. I'm pleased that the topic of the game was the theme for the last 2 months for the Cubs, which was not hitting for the most part since the All-Star break. I'm glad it didn't hang on an error or something along those lines that would, I think, taken away from how good a season this was overall for the Chicago Cubs and how unfortunate some of the injuries were. Think about having Cade Horton in this rotation in the NLDS, and how much that would have changed things, or getting him back for the NLCS, how much fun that would have been, even if it was in a short capacity, he wasn't stretched out to throw 80 pitches or anything along those lines. Well, we could jump ahead a bit and look and preview slightly the offseason for the Cubs, which is something we'll be doing a ton on MarqueeSportsNetwork.com. And, of course, on our linear Cubs 360 offseason shows that you could see on TV and in the Marquee Sports Network app. I'll be on those, I imagine, occasionally throughout the offseason, talking through things. We'll have some offseason coverage as well, I imagine, when the team does end-of-season pressers and such, and reflects on what is a really good season from the Chicago Cubs, just not as good as the Milwaukee Brewers. It's like a game of golf. The Cubs played the best season they'd had in 6 or 7 years, and unfortunately, they just didn't play. That best season wasn't as good as the Brewers season. And I do believe the better team in this individual instance did win, and that was the Brewers. They've been the better team all season. They were the better team in this individual series. Previewing the offseason, let's see here. Tucker's the big free agent. Obvious, yeah. I mean, it seems like all the clamors that he's not going to return as a Chicago Cub. I truly have no idea. I'm curious to see kind of what the markets think, whether it be DraftKings or elsewhere, as to what exactly is priced as the favorite. I'm fascinated to see. I think the Dodgers are going to be in play. The Yankees are going to be in play. Maybe the Phillies will be in play. A lot of these teams that need some kind of corner outfield left-handed bat. Dodgers signing Michael Conforto and not having that work out. Yankees, of course, are always going to be in the mix, I think, on big talent. Phillies are an interesting one with some free agents of their own. Real Muto. Do they want Schwarber over Tucker? Imagine Schwarber maybe comes back. He's a fan favorite. But there's a lot of ways it could crumble for Tucker and the Cubs. And the Cubs have, again, a glut of these outfield types. So I really think to the Cubs, Tucker is maybe not as valuable as he is to other teams. Think about the end of the season Owen Casey had and the unfortunate concussion he ran into. Would have been a really interesting bat eventually to get more ABs on, but we have a small sample that looks really good for him. He's not going to step in and one-for-one replace what Tuck did this year, I don't think, but it's fun to dream on how successful he could be as a middle-of-the-order bat. I imagine not facing a ton of left-handed pitching and platooning with some right-handed outfielder. So perhaps that's a way to think of it is, who's the strong or short side platoon to an Owen Casey across a full season for the Cubs next season. If you are assuming that Tucker's not a Chicago Cub in 2026, which again, we cannot predict. A couple other free agents I want to hit on quickly before we get out of here. Shota has a really interesting thing in his contract where the Cubs can exercise a 3-year option for about $57 million, right around that ballpark. That seems like a pretty good deal for them. Again, he had a really rough end to the season. I'm speculating here, which I hate to do overall. It just feels to me like we run into spring training next year. You go to March, you hear from Shota, and he's like, yeah, for the most part, I feel like I never got right after the hamstring, and my velo was down, and now I'm better. And all of a sudden, he's maybe back to 92, 93 next season, and a lot of these home run problems, for the most part, are probably still going to hang around. But as long as they're limited, as long as they were what they were in 2024, not 2025, he's still going to be a really good pitcher on a per inning basis. He'd been fantastic this entire season. He just struggled, unfortunately, in leverage moments, which I imagine will bring up questions as to whether he can start in the postseason. But we're really not going to know that until we get back to this moment and have the Chicago Cubs in postseason situations as to whether Shota can be good. Andrew Kittredge has a $9 million club option for next season. That's an interesting one to see if the Cubs pick up. He's probably right around that from a market value standpoint. Or actually, he's probably under that. So this is a good deal for the Cubs to pick up probably the $9 million option. So I'm going to assume they do pick that up. Colin Ray has a $6 million player option. That's an interesting one. I imagine he maybe picks that up as well. Or actually, he probably goes to the market at $6 million. I mean, he pitched well enough where he could probably prove that he's worth between 10, maybe 14-ish, depending on how many years, etc. he wants to get guaranteed. Counsell, obviously, with a strong relationship with Ray. And he was an unbelievable piece to the pitching puzzle overall for the Cubs this season. And Justin Turner has a $10 million mutual option. I imagine that's going to be declined, far too rich for the kind of player he is now at this point in his career. So again, recap there, Shota, 3 for 57. I'm going to lean towards the Cubs picking that up and exercising that clause in his contract and extending him through, what would that be, 2028-ish or so. Kittredge, a club option. I'm going to assume the Cubs pick that up, and he's back on the $9 million contract. And then Ray, player option, I imagine he'll decline that and hit free agency. Turner, mutual option will be declined. Just my guesses overall. Again, we'll have you covered here on Marquee Sports Network all off-season on these various topics. The Cubs drop an unfortunate Game 5 in the NLDS. Huge thank you to anyone who's hung out with me on this podcast all season. It's been a lot of fun. Hopefully we expand it a bit next year and do some cooler things. Thanks as always for listening to the Cubs Daily Podcast. We'll have you covered throughout the offseason with some weekly shows and interviews that'll hit this podcast feed. So be sure to stay subscribed. And congrats to the Cubs for a pretty good season despite an unfortunate way for it to end.